Have you ever had that moment when you prayed, waited, and nothing? God's silence can be unsettling, almost as if He is distant or oblivious to what we are going through. But what if I told you that this silence is an answer? That behind this stillness, there is a greater purpose being prepared. It seems contradictory, I know, but it is in this silence that God speaks in a way that few are ready to understand. What if, instead of being an absence, silence was a preparation? Today, let's find out what to do when it seems like God doesn't answer. And most importantly, we will understand how to transform this silence into a profound encounter with the divine will. Are you ready to hear what He has to say, even without words? The silence of God is an experience that resonates deeply in the soul of those who seek an answer and find only emptiness. It's like shouting into a vast valley and hearing no echo, a feeling that crushes the heart and weakens faith. Prayers, once said with confidence, now seem to evaporate into thin air without ever reaching the heavens. For many, this silence becomes an almost insurmountable barrier, as if God were distant, unreachable, and faith began to waver. When God is silent, our minds are invaded by doubts. Has He forgotten me? Or did I do something wrong? These are questions that echo in our heads, accompanied by a piercing loneliness. Faith, which once seemed unshakable, begins to be eroded by uncertainty, and moments of silence can turn into a long, dark night of the soul. But what if this silence was part of a greater purpose? What if God was preparing us for something beyond what we can see or understand? Even though the silence is disconcerting, it is in this void that we are invited to delve deeper. Just like in the desert, where there are no distractions, God's silence can be a call to turn inward. It is a time of reflection, of delving into the depths of our faith, and discovering truths that can only be revealed in stillness. Perhaps, instead of seeking immediate answers, it is time to seek God Himself, even if He seems distant. This journey through silence is part of our story, and often it is in the absence of response that we find the true essence of faith. It is in this waiting that God shapes us, and thus, the experience becomes a turning point. But what to do when the silence continues? How can you keep walking when it seems like God isn't listening? This brings us to the next point of our journey: human expectations in the face of divine reality. Often, our expectations about God and how He should act are deeply rooted in our limited view of time and reality. We expect answers to arrive quickly, as if God followed our deadlines, when in fact, He works in a divine time, beyond what we can understand. It is common, in our fragility, to desire an immediate response, an intervention that takes us out of discomfort. But divine reality operates differently, requiring patience, trust, and often silence. Human expectations are constantly shaped by what we see and experience on a daily basis. When we pray, we expect signs, tangible changes, and even immediate relief from our worries. However, God does not act to satisfy our momentary needs. He works long-term, shaping every detail of our lives, even when it means letting us wait. And it is in this contrast between what we want and what He offers that we often feel frustrated. But are we really ready to accept what He gives us? Think of a seed planted in the ground. While we wait to see something sprout, for weeks or even months, nothing happens on the surface. However, beneath the earth, there is an invisible process happening, roots strengthening, preparing the way for growth. God's silence is like that seed. What appears to be inactivity is actually a profound work that we cannot yet see. He is building, preparing something in our lives that will blossom at the right time. Divine reality calls us to let go of control. We need to let go of our human expectations and embrace the fact that what God is doing in our lives may not be immediately evident. It is an exercise of faith, of trusting that, even in silence, He is acting. And so, God's silence can be the greatest lesson in humility and trust that He offers us. But how to interpret this silence? This brings us to the next point, when God's silence is actually a response. God's silence is often more than a simple lack of response. It is a response in itself. When He remains silent, it can be an invitation to dig deeper, to learn something we are not yet ready to see. Silence can be a way for God to show us that He is shaping us, preparing us for something greater. It is in this space between waiting and fulfillment that He speaks in a subtle way, between the lines of life, waiting for us to learn to listen to Him with our hearts. This type of divine response can be difficult to recognize. We are conditioned to wait for words, for tangible signs, but silence forces us to change perspective. Think about how, in a conversation, someone's silence can say so much more than hastily spoken words. The same happens with God. He may be telling us, "Wait, trust, I am here." When we read the curiosities of biblical history, we see that, in many crucial moments, God's silence prepared the ground for great upheavals. In Job's life, for example, God's silence was a period of trial and transformation. Even without a direct answer, Job was refined, and in the end, received a profound revelation about who God is. The silence was not a punishment, but a preparation. In our lives, the same may be happening. When the answers seem far away, what God is really doing is working in us, silently building something we can't yet fully understand. Silence as a response requires a new way of listening, not with the ears, but with the soul. He challenges us to look beyond our circumstances and trust that there is a purpose, even when everything seems stagnant. But how to keep faith in the midst of emptiness? How to resist the temptation to give up? That's our next point, the trial of waiting, and how faith can flourish even when everything seems silent. Waiting can be one of the greatest trials of faith. When God remains silent, we are taken to a spiritual desert where everything seems lifeless and without answers. Emptiness is scary, and it often feels like we are going in circles, without direction. But it is in this arid terrain that faith is put to the test, where we are challenged to believe not because we see or hear, but because we trust in the character of God. It is a trust that goes beyond logical understanding, which is sustained even when there is no visible evidence that something is happening. However, this waiting is not inactivity. Just like the farmer who prepares the soil and plants the seed, even without seeing immediate growth, we are called to cultivate patience and perseverance during God's silence. Faith is that seed that needs to be watered with hope, even when the harvest seems distant. The waiting time is a time of preparation, both for us and for the divine plan. Abraham and Sarah, for example, waited years for God's promise, and even in their momentary unbelief, Abraham's faith was considered righteous. During the wait, it is natural that discouragement wants to creep in. The feeling that God has forgotten us, or that we are not worthy of His attention, can overwhelm us. But it is at this moment that we need to remember the curiosities of biblical history. God never failed to fulfill His promises. Silence can be a test of endurance, an opportunity to strengthen our dependence on Him. And every moment of waiting is an invitation to deepen our relationship with God, even when He seems distant. Faith in the midst of emptiness is like walking in the dark, trusting that with each step there is a path being opened, even if we cannot see it. And, on this journey, we are invited to persevere, to continue walking, even when everything seems at a standstill. But what to do when spiritual loneliness sets in? How to deal with the feeling that God has abandoned us? This will be our next point: spiritual loneliness and how to face it. Spiritual loneliness is one of the most painful experiences a person of faith can face. When God seems distant, It's as if everything around us loses meaning. What was once a source of comfort now becomes a constant reminder of the absence of answers. We feel abandoned, lost in a silent darkness, where even prayer seems to echo with no return. This feeling of abandonment can eat away at the soul, leaving us vulnerable to deep doubts about our own faith. But this loneliness, however overwhelming it may be, does not mean that God has abandoned us. Even the most faithful experienced moments of despair and isolation. Think of David, who in many of his psalms cried out to God, feeling forgotten, asking to be remembered. However, what these stories show us is that even in solitude, God was never truly absent. Sometimes He is teaching us to walk on our own 2 feet, to trust Him without depending on external signs. It is important to remember that this spiritual solitude can be a transitional phase. When we feel disconnected from God, it can be a time when He is challenging us to grow, to mature in faith. The feeling of abandonment forces us to search deeper, to hold on to the promises He has made to us. And as we see in the curiosities of the history of faith, many of the great spiritual heroes passed through this valley of loneliness before finding the rebirth of their faith. Facing this loneliness requires a conscious decision not to give up, to keep searching, even when it seems like nothing makes sense. It is not an easy task, but it is in this desert that our dependence on God solidifies. And when it seems like we are walking alone, that is where He is carrying us. How can we find purpose in silence? This is our next point, the value of silence on the spiritual path. God's silence, which often seems like an absence to us, can actually be a gift in disguise. On the spiritual path, silence has a profound and transformative value. He challenges us to step away from the constant noise of the world, to stop and listen to what is happening inside us. Silence is the fertile soil where the seeds of patience, perseverance, and wisdom grow. It is when God is silent that we are forced to confront our own limitations, our fears, and our most intimate doubts. However, this silence is more than just an absence of sound. It is an invitation to introspection, to look within ourselves and find answers that we are often looking for outside. Just as Jesus was retreating to solitary places to pray, silence is a time to encounter yourself and God. It is in this space that we are shaped, where our hearts are worked in ways that the noise of life would never allow. This silence is like a peaceful sunset after a long day, a rest for the soul that can only be experienced in stillness. The value of silence lies in its ability to teach us lessons that words cannot. Curiosities from history show that, in many moments, silence was the catalyst for great transformations. It is in silence that we learn to trust, even when we have no answers. And this trust, this silent faith, is what sustains us in the most difficult times. God may not be speaking audibly, but He is always present, working in us and for us. And so, when we learn to value silence, it becomes a companion, not an enemy. He teaches us to wait patiently, to listen with our hearts, and to trust fully in God's plans. But as we delve deeper into this silent journey, questions often arise. And what do we do when we are consumed by these doubts? That's our next point: human vulnerability and the natural impulse to question God. Questioning God is something that, in our human vulnerability, seems almost inevitable. When the silence is prolonged, doubts arise, and we ask ourselves, why? Or, does God hear me? This act of questioning is not a sign of weakness, but of humanity. Since ancient times, great characters in the history of faith, such as Job and the prophets, have faced these same questions. Silence can take us to a point of extreme vulnerability, where the only thing we have is our faith, devoid of any certainty. In this moment of fragility, it is natural for doubts to arise. Job, in the midst of his pain, did not hesitate to question the reason for his suffering. However, even in the midst of his questions, he did not lose confidence that God had a purpose, even if he could not see it. What we need to remember is that God is not offended by our questions. He knows us deeply and understands our moments of crisis. Questioning is not synonymous with a lack of faith, but it can be a way to deepen it. This vulnerability, when embraced, can be transformative. By allowing oneself to question, human beings open up space to reflect on their own spiritual journey. Instead of avoiding questions, we should welcome them and take them before God with sincerity. The curiosities of history show that many of the moments of great revelation came after periods of deep questioning. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable before God, we are giving Him the opportunity to shape us in ways we would never imagine. However, balance is key. We need to learn to question without losing confidence. It is possible to ask and still trust. The challenge is to place our doubts in God's hands, knowing that even if we don't have all the answers right now, He is with us. But what happens when our prayers seem to go unanswered? In the next point, we will explore this issue: unanswered prayer and persistence in faith. Prayer for many is the main direct connection with God. But what happens when we pray incessantly and receive no answer? It's like throwing words into the wind, not knowing if they really reach their destination. At that moment, the doubt arises: should I continue praying, or should I stop? This question touches the soul deeply, especially when we are going through critical moments and it seems that God is silent. However, the Bible teaches us about the importance of persistence in prayer, even when the silence is deafening. Jesus told the parable of the persistent widow, which perfectly illustrates this truth. The woman, at her insistence, did not give up until her cause was heard. This example teaches us that prayer is much more than asking for something. It is an exercise in faith and trust. Even when we don't hear an immediate answer, each prayer brings us closer to the heart of God. Continuing in prayer is like digging a well in dry ground. The water may not be visible on the surface, but with each dig, we get closer to the source. Unanswered prayer should not be seen as a closed door, but as an invitation to continue searching. At many moments in history, God's silence preceded great miracles. Think of the days of waiting before Moses was called to free the people of Israel. The prayer of intercession seemed to have no answer until, at the right time, God acted. Persisting is an act of faith that goes beyond what the eyes can see. It is believing that God is listening, even if He does not respond immediately. However, it is not easy to continue when the heart is tired and prayers seem to have no effect. At these times, persistence becomes an act of trust, of believing that God's silence is temporary and that He is preparing something greater. The next point leads us to a delicate question: how can God's silence shake trust and lead to a crisis of faith? God's silence has the power to shake even the firmest foundations of faith. When the answer we expect never comes, our trust in God can begin to weaken. Questions previously stifled by the pace of life begin to emerge, and faith, which once seemed unshakable, begins to crumble under the weight of doubt. Does God still care? Have I been forgotten? These questions eat away at us inside and lead us to a crisis of faith that can be devastating. It is in this crisis that many turn away, believing that silence is proof that God has abandoned them. However, it is important to understand that a crisis of faith, far from being a sign of failure, can be a catalyst for deeper spiritual growth. Curiosities from the history of faith show us that many of the great spiritual leaders, such as Moses, Elijah, and even Peter, went through moments of deep doubt. They faced the abyss of silence, but instead of giving up, they allowed the crisis to lead them to a fuller understanding of who God really is. What to do when trust in God is shaken? The first step is to recognize that having doubts does not make us less spiritual. Doubts are part of the journey of faith. Instead of ignoring them, we should take them before God, just like Job did. He did not hide his pain and confusion. He exposed his heart to God, and in the end found a deeper revelation of the divine character. The crisis of faith is an invitation to abandon our limited view of God and embrace something greater. Although painful, a crisis of faith is often the starting point for new, more solid confidence. The process of rebuilding faith, stone by stone, can be slow and challenging, but it leads us to a more authentic and deeper relationship with God. When we face silence and doubt, we can find strength in others who have walked this path before us. And that brings us to our next point: the importance of faith community in facing these moments of loneliness and doubt. The journey of faith was not meant to be walked alone. When God's silence weighs on us, the community of faith can become an indispensable support. In moments of crisis, when spiritual loneliness sets in, sharing this journey with other people of faith can make all the difference. Community not only offers us comfort, it reminds us that we are not alone in this quest. Even when God seems distant, He often reveals Himself through other people. Finding support in the faith community is like discovering an oasis in the middle of the desert. Those around us can, in their words or actions, be a reflection of the divine presence we are seeking. Stories of great biblical characters show us the value of community. The Apostle Paul, for example, faced countless trials, but he always counted on the support of his brothers in faith, who helped him continue his mission. So when faith wavers, the strength of community can be a firm foundation. Furthermore, the community of faith is a place where we are reminded of the curiosities of biblical history and the miracles that God performed in the past, which renews our hope. Sometimes the faith of others can lift us up when our own is weak, and in sharing our burdens, we find a healing that only solidarity can provide. Those who have already been through the valley of silence can offer us valuable advice and a shoulder to support our doubts and insecurities. However, it is important to choose carefully who we share our journey with. A healthy faith community guides us toward God, not despair. When we are surrounded by those who truly trust in God's plans, even when everything seems uncertain, we are strengthened. But in the midst of support, we still face the challenge of surrendering our concerns and control to God. That's our next point: the illusion of control and what it means to surrender everything to God. One of the biggest obstacles in our spiritual journey is the illusion of control. We believe that we can determine the course of our lives, make decisions, and somehow guarantee the results. When God's silence is prolonged, this illusion falls apart, and we are faced with the harsh truth that, in reality, very little is in our hands. This is the time when we are challenged to surrender completely, to let go of our attempts to control and trust God fully, even when everything seems uncertain. Total surrender to God is one of the hardest lessons to learn, especially in a culture that values self-reliance. We want to be sure that things will turn out the way we planned, but often God calls us to trust Him without reservation. It is an invitation to let go of our fears and anxieties, and believe that, even in the silence, He is in control. Throughout the curiosities of biblical history, we see that the greatest miracles happened when men and women of faith surrendered their lives to the divine plan, accepting that control was in God's hands. Surrender is not synonymous with passivity. It does not mean that we should stop acting or expect miracles without doing our part. Rather, surrender is an active decision to trust God as we do what we can, knowing that the results are in His hands. It's like sailing a boat through a storm. We do our best to stay the course, but we recognize that only God can calm the waters. When we understand this, the weight of carrying the world on our shoulders is relieved. But total surrender does not happen overnight. It's an ongoing process, a daily decision to let go of control and trust. Each time we are faced with God's silence, we have the opportunity to surrender another part of our life to Him. And the more we surrender, the freer we become. However, this journey is not lonely. God gives us little signs along the way. And that brings us to our next point: silence or signal. When God manifests himself in small gestures. Many times, we become so fixated on expecting great signs from God that we fail to notice the small gestures with which he manifests himself throughout our journey. Divine silence may seem absolute, but if we pay attention, we notice that he is speaking to us in subtle ways. These gestures can be an unexpected encounter, a word of comfort from a friend, or even the inexplicable peace we feel in the midst of chaos. When we let go of the expectation of hearing an audible voice or seeing a grand miracle, we begin to realize that God manifests himself in small details that make all the difference. In the Old Testament, Elijah expected to find God in great manifestations, in the strong wind, in the earthquake, in the fire, but surprisingly, he appeared in a soft whisper. This example teaches us that God often speaks quietly, in simple gestures, and in the curiosities of everyday history. By opening our eyes and hearts to these small signs, we are able to recognize his presence even in the midst of silence. He may be guiding us through a conversation, a thought that comes to mind, or a sense of calm in the midst of the storm. These small gestures are like stars in the night sky, discreet but lighting the way. They can be easily ignored if we are too focused on expecting something great. As we learn to value these subtle manifestations, we understand that God's silence is not empty. It is full of signs. We just need to pay attention. Instead of being paralyzed waiting for a clear and direct answer, we can move forward with confidence, knowing that God is guiding us, even if imperceptibly. As we walk in faith, we learn to distinguish when God is speaking to us through these little signs. The secret is to keep your eyes and heart open, attentive to everything he gives us, no matter how small it may seem. These gestures can be the fuel that keeps us grounded during the wait, reminding us that although silence is challenging, he is never absent. But how to deal with the internal conflict that arises when reason challenges us to give up? That's the next point: the battle between reason and faith. The human mind is a factory of questions, and it is natural that faced with God's silence, reason begins to question faith. This internal conflict between logic that seeks explanations and faith that trusts in the invisible can be one of the most challenging struggles on the spiritual journey. Reason tells us that if God does not respond, perhaps it is time to give up or seek another path. But faith drives us to continue, to believe even when all the evidence points to the opposite. It is on this battlefield that many fight their greatest struggles. This conflict is as old as faith itself. Even Abraham, known for his unwavering trust in God, had moments of doubt. When God promised him a son, reason said that in his old age this was impossible. But faith kept him firm. The story of Abraham reminds us that even when reason seems to have irrefutable arguments, faith can open doors to the impossible. This is the paradox we face, trusting beyond what logic allows us to see. The challenge is to accept that faith and reason are not enemies, but can coexist. Faith teaches us not to limit ourselves by what we understand, not to reduce God to our human capacity for reasoning. Curiosities from biblical history reveal that, in many moments, faith overcame reason, paving the way for miracles. However, this does not mean that we should completely ignore our logic, but rather find a balance where faith guides us in moments of uncertainty and reason helps us to walk in a practical and conscious way. When the conflict between reason and faith seems overwhelming, the best choice is to trust. It's a bold step, like walking on uncharted waters, but it's in this space between logic and faith that the greatest spiritual transformations occur. And it is precisely while waiting that we need to learn to cultivate a silent and patient faith. That's the next point: silent hope and the power of patient waiting. Waiting patiently is one of the most difficult virtues to practice. especially when God's silence seems to go on indefinitely. Silent hope is that which remains firm even when there are no visible signs of change. It's trusting that even though we don't see God's work happening, He is working behind the scenes. It is an active waiting, where faith feeds hope and gives us the strength to continue. God's time is not our time, and learning to wait on Him is a fundamental part of the spiritual journey. In the Bible, we see several examples of patient hope. Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, waited years before seeing God's plan come to fruition in his life. At every stage of his journey, even in the midst of injustice and suffering, he maintained his hope. This kind of hope is not passive. It requires that we continue to believe and move forward, even if God's answer seems distant. Just like Joseph, we are called to trust, knowing that, at the right time, God will manifest Himself. This wait may seem long and lonely, but it is precisely in silence that our faith and hope are refined. It is like gold being purified in fire. With each moment of waiting, our faith grows stronger and our hope becomes more resilient. The curiosities of history show us that often it is in this process of waiting that God is preparing something great. He is shaping us, preparing us for what is to come. Waiting is not wasted time. It is a time of construction. Waiting patiently does not mean resignation, but rather an act of absolute trust in God. When we trust that He is in control, we can rest in the knowledge that even in silence, He is in charge. And while we wait, He sustains us with His peace and His promise. However, silence can lead us to question God's promises, and that is what we will talk about in the next point. God's promises and what lies beyond silence. God's promises are often what sustain our faith during moments of silence. They are anchors for the soul, reminding us that no matter what we feel or experience, God is faithful to fulfill what He has promised. Silence can make it seem like these promises are far away or forgotten. But the truth is that God never stops acting. He keeps His promises at the right time, and our challenge is to keep faith alive, even when we don't see immediate signs of change. The Bible is full of examples of people who held fast to divine promises even during long periods of waiting and silence. Abraham waited for decades before seeing the promise of a son come true. During this time, he could have easily lost hope, but his faith was strengthened by believing in God's faithfulness. This unshakable confidence, even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances, is what inspires us to continue believing, even when God's promises seem far away. These promises are not just words written in an ancient book. They are alive and active, waiting for the right moment to manifest themselves in our lives. The curiosities of history show us that God never leaves His promises unanswered. However, He works differently than we expect, often using silence as part of His greater plan. Silence may be the interval between promise and fulfillment, but it does not mean that God has forgotten or given up on us. What is beyond silence is the certainty that, in God's perfect time, His promises will be fulfilled. As we wait, we are called to trust in His sovereignty and His love for us. And when doubt tries to lead us astray, we must remember that God's promises are unchanging and His faithfulness is unshakable. But as we await these promises, we are also invited to reflect on our own lives and what God may be teaching us in this quiet time. This brings us to the next point, when silence is an invitation to reflection. God's silence, in addition to being an opportunity to strengthen faith, can also be an invitation to reflection. When He is silent, perhaps He is calling us to look inside ourselves, to evaluate our lives, our choices, and the state of our hearts. Silence forces us to slow down and see what, in the fast pace of life, we often ignore. It is an invitation to a spiritual pause, where we can ask questions that only silence can bring to light. Where am I going? What does God want to teach me at this moment? Reflection leads us to a process of self-knowledge that is essential for spiritual growth. When we stop to examine our lives in the light of silence, we often discover areas that need adjusting or healing. Silence, instead of being a punishment, can be an opportunity for transformation. In the curiosities of biblical history, we see that characters like Moses and David went through long periods of reflection in the desert, where, in the midst of silence, God shaped them for something greater. During these moments of reflection, we may ask ourselves if we are truly hearing God's voice or just waiting for Him to confirm our own desires. Silence challenges us to purify our motivations and seek God's will, not our own. It is in this time that He can reveal profound lessons, not through words, but through a silent understanding that transforms the heart. Reflecting on our lives in light of His Word is the way to rediscover purpose in the midst of silence. The invitation to reflection is an opportunity to renew our mind and align our heart with God's purposes. In silence, we find clarity. We perceive truths that were hidden in the noise. And it is in this place of reflection that God can reveal His will to us more clearly. And this brings us to the next point: the encounter with God's will and how silence guides us towards it. God's silence can be the path to the deepest encounter with His will. Often, it is precisely in the absence of clear answers that we surrender and open our hearts to accept the divine plan, even without understanding all the details. God uses silence to guide us, not along paths of immediate answers, but along roads that lead us to His perfect will. When we stop seeking just what we want and focus on understanding what He wants, we begin to find meaning in the journey. God's will is not always revealed directly. Just like the potter who works patiently to mold the clay, God shapes our lives during moments of silence. Through the curiosities of biblical history, we see that those who submitted to God's will experienced a profound transformation. Think of Mary, the mother of Jesus, who, faced with an immense call, simply responded, "Your will be fulfilled in me." God's silence can be an invitation to surrender in this way, accepting that what He has for us is greater than we can imagine. Encountering God's will, however, requires a heart willing to listen beyond words. When there are no immediate answers, it is necessary to learn to trust His wisdom and His timing. Often, our limited understanding fails to see the purpose behind silence, but it is in this field that faith flourishes. Surrendered to God's will, we realize that silence is, in fact, a space of preparation for something greater, something that we cannot yet see. As we wait for God's will to fully reveal itself, we are invited to walk with confidence. The encounter with the divine will does not happen all at once, but is a continuous journey of faith and trust. As we walk, we begin to realize that even without words, God is guiding us, step by step. But, for this journey to be possible, we need something essential, an unshakable faith, which is our next point. Unshakable faith is the key that sustains us when everything around us seems uncertain. In the midst of God's silence, it is faith that keeps us standing, reminding us that He is present even when we cannot hear His voice. This faith goes beyond what the eyes can see or the ears can hear. It is anchored in the trust that God is faithful and keeps His promises. An unshakable faith is not built overnight. It is forged in the midst of difficulties, in the darkest hours, where only trust in God's character sustains us. The story of Job is a clear example of unshakable faith. Even when he lost everything and received no answers for his suffering, Job remained steadfast, declaring, "Though He slay me, I will trust in Him." This trust, this faith that is not shaken by silence, is what enables us to cross spiritual deserts. In moments when reason fails and emotions waver, it is faith that keeps us moving. one step at a time, toward the purpose God has for us. The role of unshakable faith is vital because it helps us see beyond the present moment. While silence may seem endless, faith allows us to see the bigger picture, where God is working on our behalf, even if we can't see it now. The curiosities of biblical history show us that, in every great moment of trial, those who maintained firm faith in the Lord ended up experiencing His blessings and promises in ways they never could have imagined. But this faith does not just come from a feeling or a passive belief. It demands that we hold fast to God's promises, that we feed our souls with His Word, and that we surround ourselves with people who also have strong faith. Unshakable faith is a daily decision to trust, even when all circumstances point otherwise. And when we persevere, that faith prepares us for moments of great revelation. That's the next point, God's return, when He finally speaks. There are times in the spiritual journey when, after a long period of silence, God finally speaks. When He breaks the silence, His words bring a clarity and peace that transforms everything. It's like the dawn, after a long dark night, bringing light to areas of our lives that were previously shrouded in uncertainty. God's return is a reminder that He was never truly absent. He was just preparing us to hear His voice in a new and profound way. When God finally speaks, His voice has the power to heal wounds, restore hope, and bring direction for the next step. In the story of Elijah, after the period of silence and isolation in the desert, God manifested Himself in a gentle whisper, but it was enough to renew Elijah's strength and guide him back to his mission. God's voice, even if soft, is enough to make us move forward with confidence, knowing that He is in control of every detail of our lives. The impact of hearing God's voice after silence is something that reverberates in our soul. Often, the answers we seek do not come in the way we imagined, but they bring relief and certainty that only the presence of God can offer. Fun facts from biblical history show us that when God speaks, He not only answers our questions, but gives us a broader view of His purpose for us, renewing our faith and preparing us for what is to come. However, it is important to remember that God's return does not mean the end of trials. He can give us a word of encouragement and, at the same time, prepare us for new challenges. But once we hear His voice, we know He is with us, and that assurance gives us the strength to carry on. And, even when silence returns, we carry in our hearts the peace that surpasses all understanding. That's the next point. How to find that peace in the midst of uncertainty and silence. In the midst of God's silence, there is an unexpected gift we can find: the peace that passes all understanding. This peace does not depend on external circumstances, nor on the answers we seek so much. It comes from a deeper place, where trust in God overcomes any uncertainty. When we achieve this peace, we are able to rest even in the midst of chaos, because we know that God is in control. He may be silent, but His presence is still with us, and that is what allows us to continue. This peace is mentioned by Paul in the letter to the Philippians, when he encourages us to cast our anxieties on God and trust that His peace will guard our hearts and minds. It is not a peace that the world can offer, as it is not linked to quick solutions or the end of problems. It is a divine peace which surrounds us even when everything around us seems to fall apart. It is a peace that is found in an intimate relationship with God, where trust in Him becomes the foundation of our lives. Throughout the curiosities of biblical history, we see examples of men and women who, in the midst of great adversity, found this peace. Daniel, in the lion's den, and Paul, in Roman prisons, both experienced peace that surpasses human understanding. It was not a logical peace, but a supernatural peace, which enabled them to remain firm and unshakable, even in situations of extreme danger. This peace is a promise to all of us, available even in times when God seems silent. Finding this peace requires total surrender, a complete surrender of our worries and anxieties to God's care. It comes when, in the midst of silence, we decide to trust that He is acting, even if we cannot see it. And this peace sustains us, strengthens us, and prepares us for the next chapter of our spiritual journey. But what to do when that final chapter approaches? In the next point, we will talk about the silence that speaks louder than words and how it transforms our lives. God's silence, which disconcerts us so much, often speaks louder than the words we so desire to hear. It is not a purposeless void, but a sacred space where we are invited to delve deeper into our faith. It is in silence that we find the ground to grow spiritually, where we learn to trust without seeing, to hope without answers, and to rest in the fact that God is always present, even when we cannot hear His voice. The journey through silence transforms us. What once seemed like an absence now reveals itself as a moment of preparation, an interval where God shapes our character and strengthens our faith. The curiosities of biblical history show us that after silence comes revelation. After the long night, morning appears. Silence is not the end, but the prelude to something greater, something that God is preparing in our lives. He teaches us to listen with our hearts, to perceive His presence in the smallest details, and to trust Him in all circumstances. As we walk this journey of silence, our faith is refined, our trust is deepened, and our relationship with God becomes more intimate. And in the end, we realize that God's silence was not a sign of abandonment, but an invitation to draw closer to Him, to find peace, purpose, and direction in the midst of uncertainty. Silence speaks to us, yes, and its words are deep and eternal. As we conclude this reflection, may we remember that God never abandons us. Even in His quiet moments, He is working on our behalf, preparing us for something greater. And the question that remains is, are we ready to hear what God's silence has to teach us? May we open ourselves to this experience and allow it to transform us from the inside out.
If you're interested in having a Bible like the one we use in our studies, check out the link in the first pinned comment. If you enjoy our content and can support our channel, consider buying us a coffee through Buy Me a Coffee. Additionally, if you can purchase a crucifix, we also have a link in the first pinned comment. We greatly appreciate your support. God bless, and see you in the next video.